People keep billing me as a Scottish poet. And the first time that happened, I wept with real relief, I think. Not upsetness or despair, but just finally, someone sees me as one of theirs.
Marjorie Lotfi's memories of leaving Iran as a child and subsequently leaving the US to move to the UK and ultimately settle in Scotland. This is Writer's Mosaic, What We Leave, We Carry, the series that tells the true life stories of migration to the UK.
I'm Marjorie Lotfi. We are in Galloway, which is the southwest corner of Scotland on the sea. I was born in New Orleans, Louisiana, to an American mum and an Iranian father who was in the middle of a law degree in the only state in the Union that gives civil law degrees. My dad graduated after I was born the next summer, so we left and we went back to Iran after that. I don't remember it. I've never been to New Orleans since, and I have no vision of it at all. I spent my early childhood in Tehran, Iran, until the end of 1978, when my mother and my brother and I left Tehran for Ohio, and my dad came out in 1979, which is why I always say 78, 79, although I'm sure it's not possible for one person to move across in 2 different years. I always say I was young enough to take it all in and not be afraid. And so I remember things that maybe other people who were around me at the time don't remember. It was during the time of the revolution, so the starting and the rumbling of the revolution. So when we came back from America that summer of 78, a lot of my friends at the British school didn't come back that autumn, so there was a lot of unrest, and my parents were in support of a change of regime because everyone was, because it was well known that the Shah was corrupt. Around us, women suddenly were all wearing chadors, including my mother, who is 5'10" and blonde and very obviously not Iranian. Even in a chador, she didn't look Persian. Just visually around us, the way people looked changed pretty quickly from being relatively Western, with a few women wearing a chador, including my grandmother, but my aunts, for example, didn't wear one, to everybody wearing one. But also there were demonstrations increasingly, so there were the odd demonstrations, and then they became every week, and then they became every day. A curfew was brought in, so just outside of my bedroom window, I could see people defying the curfew, walking around in white robes at night. They were determinedly breaking curfew. And so they would be dressed in flowing white robes so that the Savak, or the Iranian Guard, or the Revolutionary Guard, could see that they were determinedly breaking curfew as an act of resistance. The odd tank rolling down the street, you would drive past cars burnt out from demonstrations, or you drive through the demonstrations, as we did on the way to the airport. And my parents took us to see them. They thought it was important that we saw change happening, thinking this is how change comes for the good, not, of course, seeing what was coming beyond it. So as children, we were exposed to quite a lot because I think they thought it was a good idea. And largely they were peaceful. And so they wanted us to understand that that's how you make a change in the world. But largely when we were in Iran, we were like normal children in the middle of a city. We weren't often sent out to do errands. It wasn't particularly safe. But increasingly, because my mum was so American looking, although her Farsi was pretty good, it wasn't safe for her to go out. So in the last year, or maybe 8 or 9 months, Mum would send us out, my brother and I, out together to buy the bread or to get cigarettes across the street at the little shop across the street. And that was like incredible freedom. So in the midst of all this danger, the great irony is, as children, we had more freedom because we were allowed out and we were safe. We could speak Farsi. We looked Iranian. We were Iranian. And so, yeah, we were sent out on errands to the bakery, which was a bit further away, which we really liked. And I remember my brother holding my hand on the way back and thinking, he's telling himself he's doing that for my protection, but actually he's scared. If you've ever visited anywhere that isn't wholly Western, you'll know that traffic rules don't always apply in places like India and certainly in Iran. So driving there was a challenge, which, we also had, my dad had a driver. My mom, being the feisty woman that she is, insisted on having a Chevy Blazer there, this kind of big 4x4. And she drove it herself, just as a kind of act of defiance. And she would say, as she was driving, come on, just try me. She was, not afraid to drive in these scary conditions where people were driving whatever way they wanted to, in whichever road they wanted to. Didn't pay any attention to traffic signals at all. So it was, imagine that scene. And then, often mornings after demonstrations, the roads would be eerily quiet. And as a child, that was more disconcerting, weirdly, than the demonstrations, which became quite normal in a way. And because our parents took us to see them, we didn't think they were particularly scary, or I didn't. But the scary thing is when you come out and nothing is on the street. It's quiet, it's really silent, and there's sort of obvious puddles of things, and you think, what is that? Because you could hear gunfire from the house. You could hear an awful lot of chanting and other things as they passed in front of the house. So yeah, the silence was more worrying, I think, as a child than the noise of revolution. Particularly, my mum was worried about gunfire, when you could hear it, and thinking, how close is that and who's in danger there? Particularly as an American stuck in her own house, because as we stayed on and Americans were told to leave and she wouldn't leave and the embassy was shut, she really was putting herself at danger. So there is an instance where there was a particularly difficult demonstration, I think, coming past our house, and the neighbors came over and said, Khanum Lotfi, which just means Mrs. Lotfi, you must come and stay in our house when this goes past, because it's not safe for you to be in this house on your own, because at that point, people knew that there was an American in that house. Sometimes we would get, spray paint on the wall out front. So they came and took us into their house while the demonstration passed, and you could hear men running along the roofs of the houses at that point. So that was a scary moment. It's almost like a frog in boiling water. You think you're okay, and then suddenly you're not. And also, my mum taught English at the University of Tehran, and a lot of the revolutionaries were her students. So it gave her a sort of sense of confidence or freedom, like she would think we're okay. And, she came home from work one day. We were at my grandparents' and said, there's a really important demonstration happening across the road. Let's go up to the roof and watch it. Yeah, it was a particularly terrible one because there was a wild demonstration with the Revolutionary Guard and people demonstrating in the streets in front of a hospital because word had got out that they were going to kill the doctors in that hospital because they had, as a group, refused to hide any more bodies for the Savak, because that's what they would do. They would kill people and then dump them at the hospital, and the hospital would have to kind of paper it over in a way, apparently, or at least that's my making of that. I'm not sure about that part of it, but they did that afternoon. They lined up all the doctors and shot them. My parents tried really hard not to talk to us about the danger that wasn't evident, particularly that my mum, for example, should have been leaving as a 5'10" blonde Methodist American who spoke Farsi but with an accent. But we, as children, we heard them fighting about it at night when we were supposed to be sleeping. So, my dad saying, you really have to go. And my mom saying, I'm not leaving without you. I'm not leaving you here. Mom was resisting leaving without my dad. And my dad just wasn't able to get out because he was told his name was on a list and he wouldn't be allowed out. And so he wasn't for trying because his law partner And there were two of them had been thrown in jail, and so he was worried that he would be next if he put his head above the parapet and tried to leave. Or at least that's what I understood to be true. My dad was very clever. When the airports shut, there were a couple of flights going out that were still scheduled even though the airport was shut. And he decided that the Pan Am flights were often piloted by Iranians, but the Lufthansa flights were often piloted by Germans. And so he put us on the Lufthansa flight. I don't know how he got the tickets. And he was absolutely right. The Pan Am flight didn't go that day, but the Lufthansa flight went. I've come to understand later that it was because there was a flight crew stuck in Tehran. So the pilot landed at the airport, even though there was nobody in the tower, to collect this flight crew, and then filled the plane with the other people who'd bought tickets. And then more people who had tickets for the Pan Am flight that didn't go, they stood in the aisles of our flight as we left. But backing up from that, just even getting to the airport was a challenge. My mum was heavily wrapped up in the back seat between my brother and my father so that she wouldn't be detected. And because we had to drive through lots of demonstrations and what can really only be described as a riot. And a driver drove us, and I was in the front seat. So that was a bit of, sort of protecting of her. And then when we got to the airport, my dad couldn't come in. And so he asked my brother and I to do the speaking as much as we could because we spoke Farsi without an accent. And there were checkpoints. There were sort of 3 checkpoints. If you've seen the movie Argo, you'll know that there are 3 checkpoints we needed to get through. It was very similar to that. In fact, my parents, when they saw the movie, said, "Go and see it. It's amazing. It's so accurate. It feels like having flashbacks." And, I did see it and then thought, that was torture. Why did I watch that movie? But so we spoke for my mum as much as we could. And other people around us had to give, bribes, rings, jewelry. Everyone was wearing all the jewelry they owned on their bodies on their way out, and often had to give pieces of it away to get through the checkpoints. So there were 3 moments in the airport, at least one of which I remember clearly, that it was sort of worrying that we wouldn't get her through. But it wasn't as busy in the airport than you might expect because they were only letting people in that had tickets, and there weren't that many people with tickets for that day. The airports were shut. So there were big crowds of people outside the airport trying to get in, trying to get on those flights. But there weren't that many people in the airport itself. The flight dropped, in the way that we've all experienced of plane dropping in altitude, but dropped pretty darn hard, and the whole flight went very quiet. And as a little girl, I remember feeling guilty that I had a seat and the woman standing in the aisle, an older woman, didn't. And I remember, or at least I think I remember, sort of wanting to give the older woman my seat, and my mother telling me to stay put. But yeah, so the whole flight went quiet, and the pilot came on and said, "Don't worry, there's nothing wrong with the plane. We're just crossed over into Turkish airspace. And so we're dropping down into a normal altitude of flight," at which point the plane erupted in, whoops of joy because we'd finally made it out. So I think that is a moment as a child I realized that we had been in danger, because I think when you're as young as I was, you weren't particularly aware that, there was a risk that the flight not only wouldn't take off, but then wouldn't make it across the border. So there was a kind of real eruption of joy. There were a few moments in those very first years that we could have changed things, but the political situation in Iran was still so difficult that I think the difference for us was that the Iranian Revolution led into the Iran-Iraq War, and so nobody wanted to be in Iran. In fact, everybody was trying to get out. So had things been peaceful, things might have been different for our family, but they weren't. And so there was never the option of going home initially. And so we moved to California for a couple of years, during which time my dad studied for the bar exam to become a lawyer again, and struggled with it, if I'm honest, because English was by then very much a second language. So he was having to restudy law in a common law state, because New Orleans was a civil law state, which is why he'd studied there, because the Iranian law is civil law. So he was having to study under a kind of different system in a different language, and he struggled with it. He eventually succeeded, but it took him time. And my mum went back to work full-time as a nurse, which she hadn't done for years, which she also struggled with, because she'd been teaching and doing other things, and suddenly she was back on an operating room floor working with anesthesia, which she hadn't done in a long time. So the power dynamic in my family changed. My mom became the breadwinner. My dad was struggling and studying and taking care of us. That was a particularly difficult few years. And then my dad got a job in DC, and we moved back across the country. And that's when things changed for us as a family. So I would say at any point in those 2 years, had things changed in Iran, we probably would have gone back. Because life in Iran was very comfortable because of my dad's hard work, but it was comfortable. We were well off there, but again, not through family money, but just because of his success. I think Americans don't think much about any place that isn't America. So having worked so hard to get us there, and then having worked to remake their lives, having lost everything but a suitcase, my parents were determined that we would be Americans, fully Americans, and have all the benefits that America offered. If you work hard enough, you can be anything, that whole idea. And they did it again. They did it a second time in their 40s. And so we were so American that we also bought into this idea that anywhere else was second rate, including Britain. So we did take the odd, as money became less tight and my dad's legal practice was really successful, we did take the odd trip to, mostly for skiing in Europe. And that was sort of the pinnacle of success, I think we didn't really think about the rest of the world. Everything else was lesser. And I think it's almost a story you have to tell yourself, that you've worked so hard and given up everything and lost, in my dad's case, lost everything, not just money, because he came from a really meager background, really. So he really built everything himself and then lost it. So doing it the second time, you have to convince yourself that what you've done it for is worth it, that it is everything. And so my parents were horrified that I wanted to live in Britain, just horrified, because why would you ever leave this land of plenty? I moved to Britain working as a lawyer. They offered me a year abroad, and I thought, well, why not? I'm 25, 26, a year in London sounds great. And they paid you a lot more to live in London, because back then the exchange rate was terrible. And so, you got double the salary basically, plus the cost of living allowance. They let you rent a flat in very expensive Notting Hill or wherever you wanted to live. What you didn't realize, of course, is that you'd work your socks off and never see the light of day, but that's beside the point. And, I thought, well, I don't have another language. I can't go to the Paris office or Hong Kong, or then we had an office in Madrid. I think they still do. And so London was the one place I could go. And I thought, well, and they were really desperate. So I thought, well, it'll stand me in good stead at the firm, and it'll be an interesting experience. I never thought I would never come back to the States. So I remember, reading the press in Britain and thinking, and this is terrible, it's really disparaging. But if I'm honest, I would read it and think, who do these people think they are? They're just some little country, they've lost, they weren't at one point, but, and I've read my history enough to know that wasn't always true. But now, come on. And then being shocked by that view of my own view, even within the first year, thinking, kind of that idea, that worldview breaking apart quite quickly. And I was surrounded by Americans. Almost everyone in the London office was an American. But even then thinking, how is it we've convinced ourselves, that we are the epicenter? It was a really disturbing thought to think, okay, all this story that I've told myself, that Americans all tell themselves about, we don't need anyone else, we're in control of everything, we have all the money and all the power and all the weapons to back it all up, doesn't lend itself to think about everyone else and the impact that might have on everyone else. So when you actually live amongst other people and see that they have, their own lives and their own worlds and their own worries, and in general, I think I'd like to think the British are more worldly in that sense, do think a little bit more broadly about the rest of the world. It definitely the cracks open. And then I think it's probably what led me to start thinking about Iran and our experiences there and how we just papered over it and tried very hard to forget about it and move on. And that, of course you understand why you might do that to survive and create a new life for yourself. But when you start to pull that paper off, in the same way I started to do with my view of America, it's remarkable. It's a Pandora's box. You can't stop seeing it. Everywhere you look, you think, wait a minute. Why is it that I think the way we do this in America is better than the way they do it here in Britain? Or why is it that the British think that the way they do it is better because they've been doing it for 200 years that way? That doesn't necessarily mean it's better. On landing, my shock was that you couldn't find groceries on a Sunday, that there wasn't a pharmacy open, except maybe one in the city of London. You couldn't get a meal after a certain hour, let alone a drink. So that culture of really shutting down and not being convenience-led shocked me. I remember going into a store at 5 minutes to 5, wanting the thing in the window, whatever it was. I can't even remember what it was. And the person saying, no, we're shutting. And me saying, no, but I want the thing in the window, and I've got exact change. And I'm saying, no, we're shut. And as American, it was just completely, unbelievable to me. You would never have that happen in the States. So that kind of cultural difference, I saw it as backwardness, a lack of convenience or a lack of outward-looking ambition in that way. I found behind America. Now, behind or not, I don't know. I think now it's more about the culture and the people than it is about, being ahead or behind. So I found that really strange. And I found British people more reticent than I wanted to. I really wanted to have a life in Britain with British friends, just to feel like I was part of Britain. And that took a long time to develop because people were more closed, I think, than they were in America. I wonder if there's something about how so many Americans having to kind of be Gatsby figures and remake themselves. You never have to look a generation back. You are who you are at that moment and you're allowed to change it. No, that's a dream and I don't think that's always true anymore. But in Britain, people don't have that sense all the time. And maybe that's the reason that they're more closed initially, that they're more fixed in a way, I think. I think because I was working for an American firm in London, I never mentioned that I was Iranian except my surname. So it didn't really play in London that I was Iranian. I would go to Iranian restaurants, and then speak Farsi to the men or women running the restaurant. But in general, it wasn't that big a part of my life in London. It was only when I had children and then I was determined that they would get the gifts that I was denied, I guess. And I would stop hiding that part of my life. There was so much of my life that I was hiding because it's a dramatic story, and it costs me every time I tell it. I now realize that every time I tell it at a dinner party or whatever, it costs us all to tell these stories. And so I didn't for many years. I just kind of was just who I was. And so in London in particular, in those early years, I don't think it played much a part of who I was. I was an American lawyer working for an American firm, quite frankly, 80 hours a week. So I didn't have much opportunity to be anything else. I was lucky if I got to go to the movies or I got to go to the Tate to see something, which I did a lot by myself. But yeah, being Iranian didn't really play. And I didn't have an Iranian community in London to connect with. And in fact, I've almost always been slightly on the outside of the Iranian community, wherever I am, because my language isn't very good. And so I'm aware of that. I'm aware of being sort of half and half. I went back to New York for a year in the middle after my year was up. And I think once you've lived somewhere else, you see your homeland as a different place. And I saw even New York, which is incredibly liberal and full of people from everywhere, I saw it differently. And at the time, my partner was in London and is British. And so the choice was whether he would come over and work in New York or I would come and live in London. And I pushed so hard to be in London, which I was reminded of all the time when I complained about it later. But I wanted to live in Europe, and I know that's a controversial thing to say now, but, I really wanted to be a part of Europe. I wanted to have a life where you could fly for an hour and be in a different country and constantly be exposed to difference, rather than this sort of feeling that our world is best and we have it made and we figured it all out. So I pushed hard to get back to London, and I did. And then when it became clear that I was not coming back, that's when my parents objected to me choosing, this not quite third world country, but why would you choose Britain over America? How could you, this place with no healthcare and whatever, which is of course completely wrong. But so yeah, I think once you make your bed, then you kind of have to lie in it too. So even though there were things that were really hard about being in Britain, it was a choice that I'd very clearly made over the States. And so then I had to make the best of it. And I am a person who tries to make the best of things. I definitely see the good in things rather than the hard in things. But I think in those first years, I was always reminded that I wasn't from Britain, that I wasn't British. And that probably is what fed into me not becoming a citizen for almost 20 years. Even though I had the right to apply, I never did. I just did a year ago now. But I was really aware that I was different and just didn't fit in, and that I would never be British. And so what was the point in getting a passport? I think for all of our complaining about Americans, there is a sense that Americans do some things well. And so there's a latent respect, as much as we like to poke at them. And I do too. There is a feeling that Americans are hardworking, that they tend to be quite open, rightly or wrongly. And so for as much grief as I've had for being an American, I think people also kind of know what they're getting. And there isn't this feeling that I've left something, I hate this and I don't agree with it, but there's a feeling that I've left something less good behind. And therefore I've come to the land of plenty. In fact, I think people think it's a choice that I've actively made to be here rather than leaving something and being forced to be here. So that works for you, I think. People are terribly disparaging about Americans. The government at the moment, or in the last few years, doesn't help. Between the Bushes and President Trump, it's often a laughing stock of dinner tables. But even early on, I remember being told at a dinner party, "Don't worry about what you're wearing, dear. Americans don't know how to dress." I think Americans get known for being bolshy and loud and thoughtless, and the people on the train that you can hear, and they do speak louder, I'll admit it, because it annoys me now too, but, the people in a restaurant that you can hear, the people who talk over other people who don't think carefully about what they say, they'll make broad, sweeping, not very bright statements. Now, of course, that is true for some people, I'm sure, but it's true for British people too. It's just, I'm always aware of those criticisms, and I'm a person who takes them personally, so then I carry them around with me and am careful to not be all those things that people attribute to the American in the room. I'm always identified as an American. Even this week someone said to me, "Well, how long have you been here?" And I said, longer than I've been anywhere else. That's the weird thing. I think when I tipped over into being in Britain longer than I'd lived in the combination of America and Iran together, I thought, that's it. And all my kids are British, so I'm going to have to do something about it, which is probably what tipped me into applying for citizenship, which itself was a really interesting, difficult journey for me. When I moved to Scotland and it became clear I wasn't going home again, a neighbour across the road who's long dead who was American and had lived in Britain 45 years, he said, "Be careful. The longer they'll never see you as British. You'll never be a Brit. But the longer you stay here, the less you'll be an American as well. So when you go home, you'll be seen as British. And when you're here, you'll be seen as American." And so he said, "You'll end up in the water somewhere. That's where I've been." And it's true for race as well. You're never one thing or the other. And so that's the trouble. The longer you stay out with your kind of homeland, wherever that might be, you're never going to be from there again. I think the notion of race in America comes from a completely, well, its own version of history, a different version. One that is super recent, even in the generations in my family, my living memory, there's real racism in my family. Not with any malice. If you can say that racism is not malicious, I'm not sure you can, but not with any conscious malice, I would say. But just with the way that that's how they were and how they were raised, and they didn't see it. And again, I'm not sure as an adult I want to excuse it in that way, but there we are. But it's really recent, and it's tied to a particular time in the country's history and civil war. And it's a particular thing about blackness, which I think trickles down to other races. Whereas here, there's, the Indian and Pakistani communities, I think, blur those edges. In the Caribbean community, it's not as clear as being African American. In the US, it was, and 20 years ago, and I'm sure it's shifted, about being African American. And I remember having to catch myself in Britain and not say that because, it's not okay to call someone black in America, or wasn't. But you can't put a name on it here. You can't put the name on the otherness here. And so, while I think there is racism in both places, and I've experienced it in both places, I don't think it's the same. It comes from a different parentage, as it were. And so because of it, it plays out in different ways. London was an easy place to live, being a Iranian American, because it's a itinerant population, lots of people from everywhere else, not just within Britain, but all over. And so I used to always say in New York, people don't care where you're from. They'll ask you where you're from, and then they'll move on. The conversation moves on. The difference in Britain is that people will ask you where you're from, and they're kind of interested. And so the conversation would carry on in a way that would other you, I think. Scotland is a different beast entirely. People are incredibly warm and incredibly friendly. And yet, for me, I'm so different from people in Scotland. Scots tend to stay or come back to Scotland. They have generations of family in Scotland. They're interested in religion in a way that I don't fathom particularly. I understand more about now, but I don't agree with. And so I shouldn't say I don't agree with religion. I just don't agree with the way that it differentiates us from each other. So Scotland has been an incredibly warm, beautiful place to raise children, easy place to raise children in the sense that they're free in a way that they might not have been, but at the expense of me being very other in this place, both as an American, as an Iranian too. And it's the place I've felt most Iranian, strangely, because people aren't satisfied with, because I'm so brown in Scotland, in a place that I'm in a way that I'm not often in London, or certainly not in New York. And so, people are not satisfied with a "you're an American" answer. They always ask the follow-up, but no, really, where else are you from? And, where are your parents from? And then, of course, I end up telling the whole story about being Iranian and coming out. So in Scotland, it's a double edge. It's been wonderful and safe and welcoming. And also, I've always been on the outside of it. I just took citizenship a year ago on Nowruz, which they offered me a few dates, and I thought it was a auspicious date to become a Brit. And that was a really difficult process. My application took a long time, probably, I gather, because I'm Iranian. And I object to a lot of the questions in the test as well, which is, go look for yourself if, it's just bonkers. Some of the things they ask and the way they slant, but the British history and some of the questions are not correct. But anyway. People keep billing me as a Scottish poet. And the first time that happened, I wept with real relief, I think. Not upsetness or despair, but just finally, someone sees me as one of theirs. And yet, and I am a Scottish poet because I've only ever been a poet in Scotland. I wasn't a poet in New York or anywhere else, or at least not publicly so. But yeah, I still have questions about whether I will ever kind of be British, I think. even though I am on paper, which helps with passports. I came to Scotland in the summer of 2005. By then I had stopped practicing law and I had 2 small children. And my then husband left his legal work in London to join the Scottish Bar. Part of the decision was to be near somebody. You know, he was very much feeling a Scot in London. And at the time he used to say, I feel more Scottish in London than I ever felt in New York, because he had worked in New York too. It was a real thing to be a Scot in London at the time. People were always making a thing of it. And so we decided we might as well be near family, near someone with these 2 little children. I loved Edinburgh. It was a beautiful place, easy to walk everywhere. My problem with being a mum, a stay-at-home mum in London, was that I was kind of isolated from what I thought of the beautiful parts of the city and the kind of culture, which I really wanted. And so Edinburgh just gave me a chance to go straight into galleries with my buggy and concerts terrific concerts at night, and real culture as well as the outdoors, which I really missed. And so the decision was to come north to be near the woods and near the sea, and also let me be a stay-at-home mum that wasn't frustrated all the time by being stuck. I can't go back to Iran just now. They would let me in for sure, because I'm a citizen. It's always a question about whether they let you out again. And so I don't know that I would have any trouble, but it's not worth a risk with children, and it's just not worth a risk. So no one in my family is really traveling back and forward at the moment. They did for a little bit, but yeah, no one's traveling back and forth. So no, I wouldn't go back, but I would love to go back. You know, I would give my back teeth to go back to Iran, and I really hope that things stabilize enough that someday I will be able to go back. Even my children wouldn't take a risk of going there, I don't think, because they could arguably be citizens and then be stuck. So yeah, we'd all love to go back. I'd love to see the places I left, and I have a huge amount of family there, lots of whom I've never met. So yeah, I'd love to go back there.